The wagon wheel, stubbornly mired in mud, groaned its protest as another crack of lightning split the oppressive sky. Rain, cold and relentless, plastered her hair to her face, mingling with the sweat of desperate exertion. Elara leaned into the harness, every muscle screaming, but the wagon remained a steadfast prisoner of the earth. She glanced back at the small, bundled form nestled beneath a scrap of canvas, Lily, just 6 years old, shivering despite the layers. Their meager belongings, all that remained of their shattered life, were lashed precariously to the cart. They were alone on the vast, unforgiving plains, miles from the nearest settlement, and night was falling with a chilling finality. A low rumble of thunder vibrated through the ground, not just from the storm, but from something else, something larger and closer. Her heart hammered against her ribs. Wolves, or worse, the men who'd driven them from their home, their cruelty, a fresh brand on her soul. She knew, with a gut-wrenching certainty, that they wouldn't survive the night out here. Her gaze swept the horizon, a frantic plea to the indifferent sky. That's when she saw it, a wisp of smoke, impossibly far, a silent promise of shelter in the encroaching darkness. It was a gamble, but they had no other hand to play. With a ragged sigh, Elara adjusted her grip, knowing she had to keep moving, or they would be lost to the storm and the shadows gathering all around them. The child coughed, a small, weak sound that spurred Elara to renewed, frantic effort. They had to reach that smoke. They simply had to. The small cabin, little more than a sturdy hovel, appeared suddenly from the swirling rain and encroaching gloom. It was dark, save for the faint glow of embers through a rough-hewn window. Hope, a fragile, almost forgotten sensation, flickered within Elara. She untangled herself from the harness, her limbs stiff and aching, and hurried to the cabin door, Lily clutched tightly in her arms. She pounded, a desperate, uneven rhythm against the solid wood. Silence answered her, broken only by the relentless drumming of rain. Fear, cold and sharp, began to prickle. What if it was abandoned? Or worse, what if it was occupied by someone even more dangerous than the storm? She pounded again, harder this time, her voice hoarse as she called out, "Please, we need help. My child is sick." The door creaked open, just a sliver, revealing a vertical line of darkness. A man stood there, silhouetted against the faint interior light. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and his face was obscured by shadow, but his presence was commanding, almost intimidating. He said nothing, simply regarded her with an unreadable stillness. Elara held Lily tighter, her voice trembling. "My wagon's stuck. We've been traveling for days. We just need shelter, for a few hours. Please." The man's gaze dropped to Lily, then back to Elara's mud-streaked, desperate face. His silence stretched, heavy and tense, and for a terrifying moment, she thought he would refuse. Then, with a slow, deliberate movement, he opened the door wider. "Come in," he rumbled, his voice rough, like stones shifting in a riverbed. It was not an invitation, but a command, and Elara, with no other choice, stumbled into the warmth and dim light of the cabin, bringing the scent of rain and despair with her. The cabin was sparse but orderly, smelling of pine smoke and something else, something wild and untamed. A small fire crackled in a stone hearth, casting dancing shadows across the single room. The man closed the door with a quiet thud, sealing them in. He moved with a quiet efficiency, placing a kettle over the fire and gesturing towards a rough bed in the corner. "Put the child there," he said, his eyes still unreadable, but his tone held a gruff undercurrent that wasn't unkind. Elara carefully laid Lily on the bed, wrapping her in her own shawl. The child's breathing was shallow, her skin alarmingly pale. Elara turned back to the man, who was now pouring steaming water into a tin cup. "Thank you," she managed, her voice thick with emotion. He handed her the cup. "Drink." He didn't offer one for himself, simply watched her with an intensity that made her skin prickle. As she sipped the warm, weak tea, she finally got a clearer look at him. His face was weathered, etched with lines that spoke of hardship and solitude. A scar, thin and white, ran from his temple down to his jaw, adding to his rugged appearance. His eyes, when they finally met hers directly, were a startling shade of gray, like a storm-laden sky. He was not a young man, nor was he old, but somewhere in between, carrying the weight of years in his weary posture. "I'm Elara," she offered, feeling the need to break the oppressive silence. He merely nodded, his gaze returning to the fire. "And this is Lily." Another pause, longer this time. "Caleb," he finally said, his name a low murmur, as if accustomed to not speaking it aloud. He moved to a small, cluttered workbench and began sharpening a knife, the rhythmic scrape of steel against stone the only sound in the small cabin. Elara watched him, a knot of apprehension tightening in her stomach. He had offered shelter, but his silence was unnerving, his presence a mystery. Hours later, the storm raged outside, a symphony of wind and rain against the cabin walls. Inside, a fragile truce had settled. Caleb had given Lily a small portion of warm broth, carefully spoon-feeding her until her eyelids grew heavy. She now slept, a faint flush returning to her cheeks, a quiet miracle. Elara sat by the fire, wrapped in a coarse wool blanket Caleb had silently offered. He had returned to his knife sharpening, his back to her, creating a boundary she dared not cross. Yet the warmth of the fire, the secure feeling of the cabin around them, and Lily's steady breathing began to thaw the rigid fear in Elara's heart. She finally broke the silence, her voice soft. "Thank you, Caleb. You ... you saved us." He grunted, a non-committal sound without turning. "The storm would have taken you." His words were stark, devoid of sentiment, yet they carried a brutal honesty that Elara appreciated. "Why are you out here alone?" The question hung in the air, direct and unexpected. Elara hesitated. Her story was a painful one, a tale of loss and injustice, of a husband taken by sickness and a home stolen by greedy men. It was a story she rarely spoke aloud. We ... we lost everything," she began, her voice catching. "My husband died of a fever last spring. The bank took our land. There was nowhere else to go. I was heading west, trying to find my sister in Oregon. She didn't offer more, and he didn't press. He simply continued sharpening his knife, the only sign he was listening the slight dip of his head. "And you?" she ventured, daring to ask in return. "Why are you here, so far from ... everything?" Caleb stopped his work, the silence suddenly absolute. He turned slowly, his gray eyes meeting hers across the dim cabin. The firelight flickered, making the scar on his face seem to deepen. "Some things," he said, his voice low, "are best left unsaid." The unspoken weight of his words filled the room, a heavy curtain drawn over a painful past. The next morning dawned crisp and clear, the world washed clean by the storm. Outside, the rising sun painted the sodden landscape in hues of gold and amber. Inside, a different kind of light was breaking. Lily, though still weak, was awake and looking brighter. Elara had made a small fire in the hearth, and the scent of coffee, dark and strong, filled the cabin. Caleb was outside, tending to something unseen, his movements quiet but purposeful. When he returned, he carried a small, freshly caught rabbit. His eyes met Elara's, and for the first time, she saw a flicker of something beyond weariness, a quiet, almost hesitant offering. He didn't speak, simply set the rabbit down on his workbench and began to skin it with practiced ease. Elara watched him, a strange mix of gratitude and curiosity swirling within her. He was a man of few words, but his actions spoke volumes. He had given them shelter, food, and a chance at life. After he finished, he turned to her. "The wagon," he said, his voice clipped. "We'll get it out." It wasn't a question, but a statement of intent. Elara nodded, a fresh wave of hope washing over her. She knew, without a doubt, that she couldn't move the heavy wagon alone. As they walked towards the mired wagon, the air was cool and fresh, carrying the scent of damp earth and pine. Caleb moved ahead, his long strides covering the ground quickly. Elara followed, her gaze lingering on his broad back. He was a mystery, a solitary figure carved from the wilderness, yet he possessed a quiet strength that drew her in. She realized, with a start, that she no longer felt the prickle of fear when she looked at him, but something akin to respect, and perhaps a flicker of something warmer. The sun, now higher in the sky, cast long shadows before them, stretching towards the still-stuck wagon and the unknown future that lay beyond. They worked in silence, the only sounds the grunts of exertion and the squelch of mud. Caleb assessed the wagon, his brow furrowed in concentration. He retrieved a sturdy log from a nearby thicket and with surprising strength began to wedge it beneath the stuck wheel. Elara, despite her fatigue, found renewed strength, pushing against the side of the wagon as he commanded. He guided her with brief, sharp instructions, his hands on the heavy wood, his muscles straining. She watched the cords in his neck tighten, the damp hair plastered to his forehead. He was strong, undeniably so, but there was a controlled grace to his movements, a quiet determination. Finally, with a resounding pop and a sucking sound, the wheel broke free. The wagon lurched forward, then settled precariously on firmer ground. Elara slumped against it, breathless, mud splattered across her face and clothes. Caleb, wiping a bead of sweat from his temple, turned to her. His gray eyes, usually so guarded, held a flicker of something that might have been approval. "Good," he said, his voice a low rumble. "Now to the road." He didn't offer help with the reins, nor did he linger. He simply walked to the front of the wagon, secured the lead rope, and began to pull. Elara, still catching her breath, watched him go. He was not a man of grand gestures, but of quiet, steady action. As they slowly made their way back towards the cabin, a sense of something settling, something steady and reliable, began to take root in Elara's heart. The road ahead was still long and uncertain, but for the first time in what felt like an eternity, she didn't feel entirely alone. Back at the cabin, a different kind of work began. Elara tended to Lily, who was now awake and asking for stories. Caleb, after securing the wagon, disappeared into the woods, returning with an armful of split firewood. The cabin, with the fire crackling and the scent of roasting rabbit filling the air, began to feel less like a temporary refuge and more like a home. As the sun began to dip towards the horizon, painting the sky in fiery oranges and purples, they ate in comfortable silence. Lily, propped up on the bed, ate with surprising appetite, her small hand reaching for a piece of bread Elara offered. Caleb watched them both, his gaze lingering on Lily with an almost imperceptible softening. Later, as the stars began to prickle through the darkening sky, Elara sat by the fire, mending a tear in Lily's dress. Caleb sat across from her, meticulously cleaning his rifle. The rhythmic click and slide of metal was a strangely comforting sound. "You're good with a rifle," Elara observed quietly. He grunted. "Necessary out here. Is there anyone with you?" "Family?" she asked, carefully, testing the boundaries of his silence. He paused, the rifle held steady in his hands. His gaze drifted to the flickering flames. "No," he said, the word a heavy sigh. "No one left." The words were simple, but the raw grief they held was palpable. Elara felt a pang of sympathy, a recognition of shared loss. She knew that feeling, the crushing weight of being utterly alone in the world. "I'm sorry," she whispered. He nodded, a barely perceptible dip of his head. "It's the way of things." But his eyes, when they briefly met hers, held a depth of sorrow that contradicted his stoic words. The cabin, once a place of tense silence, now held a different kind of quiet, one filled with unspoken understanding, a fragile bridge built between two solitary souls. Days bled into a week. The storm had passed, but something else lingered. Elara found herself unable to leave. Lily, still recovering, was too weak to travel, and Elara, despite her initial apprehension, found herself strangely reluctant to move on. Caleb, for his part, made no mention of their departure. He continued his quiet routines, hunting, mending, maintaining the cabin, always with that stoic reserve. Yet small things shifted. He started leaving freshly caught fish or game on the small table for her to cook. He fixed the broken hinge on the wagon, his calloused hands working with unexpected gentleness. One afternoon, while Elara was washing clothes by the nearby stream, she watched him teach Lily how to skip stones across the water. His rough voice, usually so quiet, was softened by a patient cadence as he guided her small hand. A warmth spread through Elara's chest, a feeling she hadn't realized she was missing until now. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of deep violet and fiery orange, Elara sat by the fire, braiding Lily's hair. Caleb was outside, chopping wood, the rhythmic thud of the axe echoing through the twilight. Lily, her eyes already heavy with sleep, snuggled closer. "He's nice, Mama," she murmured, her small voice barely a whisper. Elara smiled, brushing a strand of hair from Lily's face. "Yes, he is." She looked towards the door, listening to the steady thud of the axe. Caleb was a man of the wilderness, untamed and solitary, yet he had, with quiet actions, built a small haven for them in the heart of it. A small, dangerous hope began to blossom in Elara's heart. Could this unexpected refuge become something more? The air grew colder as autumn deepened, bringing with it a sense of urgency. Winter would soon be upon them, a harsh mistress on the plains. Elara knew they couldn't stay forever, yet the thought of leaving, of venturing back into the vast, uncertain world, filled her with a profound weariness. One evening, as the wind howled outside, rattling the cabin windows, Elara finally spoke the words that had been weighing on her. "We should be going soon, Caleb, before the snows really set in." Caleb, who was whittling a small wooden bird by the fire, stopped. The small knife paused in his calloused hand. He didn't look at her, his gaze fixed on the intricate carving. The silence stretched, tense and heavy, broken only by the crackle of the fire and the wind outside. "Where will you go?" he finally asked, his voice low, devoid of emotion. "Oregon." "To my sister," she replied, though the conviction in her voice felt fragile. "It's a long way." His words were a simple statement of fact, but they carried a deeper meaning. "I know." She looked at him, her heart thumping. "You've been good to us, Caleb. More than good. We ... We owe you everything." He finally met her gaze, his gray eyes shadowed by the firelight. A flicker of something unreadable passed through them. "You owe me nothing." He looked back at his carving. "This place, it's not for everyone. It's hard." Elara knew he wasn't just talking about the land. He was talking about himself, about the life he led, the scars he carried. He was telling her, in his own quiet way, that he couldn't be what she needed, that he was too broken, too solitary for a settled life. But Elara saw something else. She saw a man of immense strength and quiet kindness, a man worth risking everything for. She saw a sanctuary, not just a cabin in the wilderness, but a chance at a different kind of life. A life built on quiet understanding, shared hardship, and the unspoken language of the heart. A knock, sharp and sudden, shattered the quiet of the late afternoon. Elara, startled, dropped the small piece of cloth she was mending. Caleb, who had been cleaning his rifle, froze. His hand instinctively went to the weapon, his body tensing, his gaze fixed on the door. It wasn't the tentative knock of a lost traveler, but something harder, more demanding. Lily, who had been playing quietly with a stack of carved wooden blocks, looked up, her small face mirroring Elara's apprehension. Caleb moved with silent speed, stepping in front of Elara and Lily, shielding them. He motioned for them to stay low, his eyes narrowed, his jaw set. "Stay behind me," he murmured, his voice a low growl. The knock came again, louder this time, followed by a gruff voice. "Anyone home? We saw smoke. Got a flat wheel a few miles back." Elara's blood ran cold. The voice was familiar, chillingly so. It was Silas, one of the men who had driven her from her home, a man whose cruelty she would never forget. Caleb looked at Elara, a question in his eyes. She nodded, a grim confirmation. He knew, instinctively, that these were not friendly strangers. With a slow, deliberate movement, Caleb cocked the rifle. The metallic click echoed in the tense silence of the cabin. "Stay calm," he whispered, his gaze unwavering as he stared at the door. "No matter what happens, you don't make a sound." The air in the cabin crackled with a sudden, dangerous tension. The sanctuary they had found, the fragile peace they had built, was about to be shattered. The knock came a third time, followed by the jiggling of the doorknob. This time, the voice held an edge of impatience, of menace. "We know someone's in there. Open up, or we'll open it for you." Caleb didn't answer. He stood his ground, rifle raised, a silent, formidable barrier. Elara clutched Lily close, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She could hear the muffled voices outside, a low murmur of conversation, then a sudden, sharp bang against the door. "Last chance!" Silas's voice, rough and menacing, cut through the wood. Caleb remained still, a statue carved from granite. He was a man prepared to face down the world, to protect what little he had. Another bang, harder this time, and a crack appeared in the rough-hewn wood of the door. Fear, cold and visceral, threatened to overwhelm Elara. But then she looked at Caleb. His stance was unwavering, his eyes focused, filled with a quiet, dangerous resolve. He was not afraid. He was ready. And in that moment, a strange calm settled over her. She trusted him. She trusted him with her life, with Lily's life, with everything. Suddenly, the door splintered inward, torn from its hinges. Silas stood there, framed in the doorway, a cruel smirk on his face, two other men behind him. His eyes, cold and calculating, swept the cabin, then landed on Elara, and finally on Caleb, holding the rifle. The smirk vanished, replaced by a sneer. "Well, well, what do we have here? Looks like the little widow found herself a protector." His gaze hardened. "Put the rifle down, old man. This doesn't concern you." Caleb didn't move. His finger was steady on the trigger. "It concerns me now," he said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. The air thickened with unspoken threats, a silent battle of wills playing out in the dim light of the cabin. The standoff stretched, moments ticking by like hours. Silas, growing impatient, took a step into the cabin. "I said, put it down," he snarled, his hand dropping to the pistol at his hip. Caleb's eyes, cold as winter ice, didn't waver. "One more step," he warned, his voice barely above a whisper, "and you'll be the last thing he sees." His gaze was fixed on the man behind Silas, who, sensing the deadly seriousness in Caleb's voice, hesitated. Silas, however, was fueled by arrogance and a history of getting his way. He laughed, a harsh, humorless sound. "You think you can stop us, old man? We'll take what we want, and there's nothing you can do about it." As Silas lunged forward, Caleb's rifle cracked. The sound was deafening in the small cabin. Not aimed at Silas, but at the lantern hanging from the ceiling. It exploded in a shower of glass and oil, plunging the cabin into sudden, suffocating darkness. Only the embers in the hearth provided a faint, flickering light. Chaos erupted. Shouts, the scramble of heavy boots, and the metallic clang of a dropped weapon. Elara heard a grunt, a heavy thud, and then the unmistakable sound of Caleb's fist connecting with flesh. She huddled closer to Lily, covering her ears, but her eyes strained to see through the gloom, her heart thundering. Caleb moved like a shadow, a force of nature unleashed. The men, blinded by the sudden darkness, were disoriented. She heard another grunt of pain, a muffled cry, and then a struggle near the door. The fight was brutal, silent save for the sounds of impact and ragged breathing. Elara clung to Lily, her mind racing, a primal fear clutching at her. But beneath the fear, a fierce protectiveness swelled, a mirroring of Caleb's own. She was no longer just a victim. She was part of this fight, this desperate stand for their fragile haven. Then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the fight was over. The sounds of struggle faded, replaced by the heavy breathing of one man. Caleb. He stood silhouetted against the broken doorway, rifle still in hand, his chest heaving. The other men were gone. Whether they had fled or were simply incapacitated in the darkness, Elara couldn't tell. A tense silence descended, broken only by the wind whistling through the shattered doorway and the rapid beating of Elara's heart. "Are you all right?" she whispered, her voice trembling. Caleb turned, his form indistinct in the gloom. "They're gone, for now." His voice was rough, strained, but there was a note of grim triumph in it. He moved to the hearth, stirring the embers until they flared, casting a warm orange glow across the cabin. In the flickering light, Elara saw him clearly. His face was streaked with soot, and a thin line of blood trickled from a cut above his eye. His shirt was torn, but his stance was still resolute, his gaze unwavering. He was bruised, but unbroken. He had fought for them, for their safety, and in doing so, he had silently declared a fierce, unwavering commitment. He had offered more than shelter. He had offered protection, a shield against the cruelties of the world. Elara looked at him, her heart overflowing with a gratitude so profound it felt like a physical ache. The walls of his solitude, once so impenetrable, had cracked, revealing the true depth of his character. In that moment, she knew with absolute certainty that she couldn't leave him. This wasn't just a place they had found refuge. It was a place where they had found each other. The next few days were a blur of mending and rebuilding. Caleb, despite his injuries, set about repairing the door with a quiet determination. Elara helped, fetching supplies, holding planks, her hands rough and blistered. Lily, sensing the shift in the atmosphere, played quietly by the fire, occasionally offering a small, worried glance at Caleb's bruised face. The unspoken tension of Silas's return hung in the air, a constant reminder of the world beyond their cabin walls. But alongside it, a new feeling bloomed, a sense of shared purpose, a quiet camaraderie that deepened with every swing of Caleb's hammer, every patch Elara sewed onto his torn shirt. One evening, as the first snow of winter began to fall in soft, silent flakes, Elara found Caleb sitting by the fire, carving a new wooden bird. The firelight flickered across his face, highlighting the lines of weariness, but also a newfound softness in his eyes. "They won't forget," she said, her voice quiet. "Silas, he won't let it go." Caleb nodded, his gaze fixed on the small bird taking shape in his hands. "No, he won't." He paused, then looked up, his gray eyes meeting hers. "But neither will I." The words were a quiet vow, a promise spoken not just to her, but to himself, to the life they were now building. He was not just protecting them from an external threat. He was claiming a future he hadn't known he wanted. He stood up, walked to the window, and looked out at the falling snow. "Winter's here," he murmured, a hint of something resembling peace in his voice. "We're safe, for now." He turned back to her, a faint, almost imperceptible smile touching his lips. "It's a long way to Oregon, Elara." Elara met his gaze, her heart soaring. She knew what he was saying. She knew what he was offering. It wasn't a grand declaration of love, but something far more profound. A quiet, steadfast commitment, a promise of shared hardship and a future forged in the wilderness. The snow fell steadily through the night, blanketing the world in a pristine, unbroken white. The next morning, the cabin was a warm, glowing island in a sea of white. Lily, fully recovered, burst with excitement at the sight of the snow, her laughter echoing through the small room. Caleb, a rare smile gracing his lips, fashioned a small sled for her from a piece of discarded wood. Elara watched them, a profound sense of peace settling over her. This was home now. This quiet cabin, this man, this child, this was their found family, their sanctuary against the world. Later, as the short winter day began to fade, Elara found Caleb sitting by the fire, holding the small wooden bird he had carved. He handed it to her. It was a perfectly rendered cardinal, its delicate wings poised for flight. "For Lily," he said, his voice softer than she had ever heard it. But his gaze, as it met hers, held a deeper message. "Elara," he began, his voice hesitant, "I can't be what you need. I'm a man of this land, alone by nature. My past ... it's a heavy thing." He looked away, his jaw tightening. Elara reached out, her hand gently touching his arm. "Your past made you who you are, Caleb, and I see a good man. A kind man. A man who fought for us. A man who built a home when there was nowhere else to go." She paused, her voice trembling slightly. "Maybe ... maybe I don't need the man you think I need. Maybe I need you just as you are." He turned back to her, his gray eyes searching hers. In them, she saw the raw vulnerability he usually kept so carefully hidden. "Are you sure?" he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. Elara smiled, a radiant, hopeful smile. "I've never been more sure of anything." He reached out, his calloused hand gently cupping her cheek. The touch was hesitant, tender, a silent promise. "Then stay," he murmured, his gaze holding hers. "Stay here with me. Let us face the coming days, whatever they may bring, together." It was not a question, but a plea, a quiet yearning from a man who had long believed himself destined for solitude. Elara leaned into his touch, her heart full, her answer clear in her eyes. "Yes," she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. "Yes, Caleb, always." The wind howled outside, a mournful lament, but inside the cabin, a quiet warmth had settled. The fire crackled, casting long dancing shadows across the rough-hewn walls. Lily, nestled in her small bed, slept soundly, the carved wooden cardinal clutched in her hand. Elara sat beside Caleb, their shoulders almost touching, watching the flames. The words they had exchanged were few, but the understanding between them was vast, deep, and unspoken. He reached for her hand, his fingers intertwining with hers, a strong, comforting clasp. It was a simple gesture, yet it spoke volumes of shared burdens, of quiet promises, of a future unfolding. The world outside was still wild, still dangerous. Silas and his men were a lingering threat, a shadow that would undoubtedly return. But within these walls, in the quiet intimacy of the cabin, they had forged a haven, a new beginning. Elara leaned her head against Caleb's shoulder, feeling the solid warmth of him, the steady beat of his heart against her ear. She thought of the long, arduous journey that had brought them to this remote corner of the world, of the losses and hardships that had shaped them. And yet, here, in the heart of the wilderness, they had found something unexpected and precious, a quiet love, a gentle strength, a bond forged in shared sorrow and defiant hope. The stars, bright and numerous, glittered through the small window, silent witnesses to their quiet vows. This was not the grand sweeping romance of novels, but something far more real, more enduring, a love built on resilience, on sacrifice, on the profound understanding that sometimes the greatest strength lies in vulnerability, and the deepest connection is found in the quiet spaces between words. Together, they would face whatever the coming days might bring. Together, They were no longer alone.